So I'm going to briefly introduce Professor Bickel, who is a professor of linguistics in the Department of Comparative Language Science at the University of Zurich. It would take way too long to give you a full idea of what Balthasar does in his everyday life as a very collaborative linguist, so I'll just say a few things. I don't think there's a domain of language that he hasn't worked on, starting out with descriptive linguistics of several Tibeto-Burman languages, but he's also worked extensively, mostly in a typological framework or tradition on phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, you name it. He's also contributed to work in psycholinguistics, is much on historical linguistics, more recently language evolution, non-human animal communication systems. And one major hallmark of his work is that a lot of it is interdisciplinary. So really working with lots of prehistorians, archaeologists, neurologists, computer scientists, and more. He's given us many corpora and databases, several of them extremely important. And another characteristic which you won't find online perhaps, but which is important to say, is that he's really consistently supported many graduate students and postdoctoral researchers and turned Zurich into a real magnet for exciting linguistic research. I would say most importantly is that Balthasar's work has consistently tried to reconceptualize linguistics, starting out with linguistic typology, but I think really about reconceptualizing what it means to do linguistics as a science as a whole. And in this respect, it's really endlessly creative, and I think he's always ahead of the pack, and sometimes people follow, and sometimes maybe they'll follow a little bit later, but it's always worthwhile to pay attention to Balthasar's ideas and the methods that he proposes. Yeah, and I guess the last thing that I like to say is that rather recently, Balthasar was awarded, together with a number of other colleagues, a National Center of Competence in Research. This is a nationwide Swiss center dealing with language evolution. It's called Evolving Language. And I'll put the link here so you can see it. So I think that's all I wanted to say, Balthasar. We're really grateful for you coming and giving a talk in the conference, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Aitan, for these very nice words. It's almost embarrassing, but I hope I can live up to the promises here. Yeah, many thanks for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here and share some of the work that we're doing with you. And I'm looking forward also, obviously, to receiving your comments. Now, I hope this works now with the screen sharing. It's always a bit, no, this is a different. What happened? I think someone else shared the screen. Okay, there was some smooth jazz coming in. Okay, let me try. Okay, do people see my slide? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. Wonderful. All right. So many people have emphasized the fact that language is really a biocultural hybrid, meaning that it's clearly the product of cultural evolution over historical times, just as much as it is the product of biological evolution over geological time, so very different time scales. It's a huge challenge to tease these two apart. So how do we know that certain parts of language might reflect cultural evolution, and how do we know that certain parts reflect biological evolution? How do you know that certain parts reflect both in a co-evolutionary setting? In the past, especially in the last century, many people have sought to seek a quick answer by just asking, well, let's just find out which properties of language are invariant across culture, that is, that are universal. And if we got them, we basically know what's maybe biologically inherited, because obviously it's not subject to variation over cultural evolution. Now, over the past 2 decades, I think it has become quite clear that such an enterprise is fraught with great difficulties. And some time ago, Piantedosi and Gibson asked a nice question there. So how many languages do you have to have seen before you can reasonably well conclude that something doesn't exist, or that you capture a universal constraint? Right? Now, clearly, if you sample 50 languages and you ask, so is a object initial language, is that possible to conclude after seeing 15 languages? Yeah, maybe that's not possible, but that would clearly be a false positive, right? You want to see more languages, and if you see 2,000, you will discover them, and then you conclude, okay, well, maybe it is possible after all. But from a more principal perspective, how many do you have to see before you can make reasonable conclusions? And in their simulation experiments, and also looking at existing databases, they found, well, it's quite a few independent cases that you have to see before you can make these conclusions. In the ideal scenario, what they call here independent sample, where you already pre-screened the data and you only have maximum diversity in your sample space, you would need about 500 before you can reach a safe threshold of probability of false discoveries. Now, 500 is unfortunately still too many, because we only have 427 language families that are independent of each other according to Glottolog. So that basically raises a huge challenge, because it means that we are doomed, right? We cannot conclude absolute universals by looking at, we don't have enough independent cases, we don't have another planet to look at. It's just very challenging. So people have moved away from absolute universals, from the quest of that, and started to be more interested in statistical universals, trends like, so, well, if it's not all languages, at least most languages do X and Y, and that might still tell us something about, a general universal property of language. Now, that exercise, however, is just as difficult, it turns out. What you see in this map here is two things. First, when languages have the same color, that means they belong to the same family. Let's first look at this. What you see here is, in many continents, you have gigantic spreads of language families. So in Africa, at Niger-Congo, especially Bantu in sub-Saharan Africa, or in Australia, Pama-Nyungan swept the entire continent. Indo-European, obviously, swept huge parts of Eurasia. What this means is that these spreads they are post-Neolithic. So these spreads brushed away gigantic linguistic diversity that must have been there before, over the lifetime of our species, so up to 300,000 years. We have no trace of that. We have no trace what linguistic diversity was there before the Pama-Nyungan spread in southern Australia. Zero ideas. Same with Africa. We know a little bit, we have a few remnants in southern Africa with the so-called Khoisan group of families, but beyond that, we have no idea. So we have no access to gigantic proportions of actual linguistic diversity from current languages. The map shows yet another thing. When language families have similar colors to each other, that reflects the fact that the language families tend to have similar properties to others. But this reflects areal spread, contact-induced spreads between entire families, not entire languages, not single languages, entire families. And what you can see in the map is that Eurasia, for example, tends to have similarly colored language families. There are a few noticeable exceptions, the Yenisei in Siberia with blue shading, and there are some Caucasian languages that deviate, but overall, it's similar colors and very different from those in Africa, whereas in Africa, again, within Africa, you have greenish, and then, for instance, in the Nilotic area, you have similarly colored families, and same in the Americas. In North America, South America, you have whole regions where different language families still share similar colors, that is, you have similar structures. Now, that means that even above the level of language families, you have homogenization, assimilation between language families, which again makes it likely that we have lost gigantic aspects of linguistic diversity in prehistoric times, and we have no access to that. So the current situation we see on the planet in terms of our typological databases is really a completely degenerate set of what might have been there as linguistic diversity. And what we see is chiefly reflects of human population history, of who was in contact with whom, when, and how they traveled and so forth. We recently probed into that in a case study with some more resolution in Northeast Asia. So what we did here is we looked at the extent to which the similarities in grammatical structures between language families mirrors similarities in other cultural traits, in music, in phonology, in lexicon, but also interestingly in genetics. And what we found is that among all these traits, it is the genetic signal that is best mirrored by grammatical similarities between language families. So this suggests that the distribution of grammatical properties across language families in this area is best reflects the population history of this area. The genetics tell us this is a population of, say, about 20,000 years. So that's the time frame when these similarities were shaped. That's the time frame when these grammatical structures arrived at the distribution we see now. But what was before, we have no idea. So this again confirms this idea that what we have now is a degenerate sample of the linguistic diversity, chiefly driven by population history. And we have no idea how it relates to ideas of universal trends as characteristic of our species and not just of our last 10,000 years and what happened after agriculture and the big spreads that it induced. And so this is a general observation that you have made with these studies, but there is also a methodological problem that historical linguists are well aware of. If you take a sample of current languages, say here we have 10 languages, 8 of them red, 2 of them blue, say blue means, I don't know, object initial. You can ask, so what history was behind that? How does this develop? What was characteristic of a family that gave rise to this distribution? Well, it might have been that, yes, throughout the history of this family, red dominated and blue was the exception, but who knows? It might have been the exact opposite, that maybe for the most part of this historical development, the languages were blue, and it's only more recently that they turned into red. These cases they exist. And so it's very hard to make inferences about, statistical trends from synchronic data. And when we say, oh, this is typologically common or rare, we should be very careful because we don't really know what this means and whether this reflects something about language with a capital L or something about the post-Neolithic situation that we find ourselves in. Now, what I want to do in this talk, I want to probe into this a bit dig into this a bit deeper by looking at 2 specific aspects of language that have to do with how languages express agents. And that is ergativity and language with, patient initial order, object initial order. And so the kinds of phenomena I want to look at is this. So, for example, we have here an example from Tsintang on ergativity. The idea is that it's the patient that is the most privileged semantic role that is mapped onto the nominative case. And that's also in this language, for instance, the target of control constructions. And so if you hear a sentence like OConnell, as a beginner learning Tsintang, it throws you off because you would think, well, you should hit someone with a stick, right? But that's not what's the intention. The intention of the sentence is one should hit you with a stick. Someone should hit you. You should get hit because it's the patient that's the target of the control construction. It's ergative syntax here. And the other thing I want to look, so this is the kind of ergativity I have in mind, but I will mostly focus just on the case marking because that already is big enough of a challenge. And the other thing I want to look is P initial orders, like you have in Iowa, an Austronesian language, where the patient, as in the basic word order, precedes the agent is the initial argument of the verb. Now, looking at phenomena like this, typology in the past have been quick in making generalizations and positing universals. I mean, there is the famous Greenberg's very first universal, subject, procedure, objects. Well, if you look at the map, yeah, that seems to be the case. It's mostly red here, which means A before P. But then, there is also quite a few languages that are purple, that are more flexible, more variable. And there is also quite a few blue spots on the map. And so how do we know? Now, if what I said in the beginning has any consequences, we cannot trust these maps, because maybe the distribution we see here is the reflex of the spreads after agriculture, of these gigantic aerial spreads that we have seen reflecting population history and how people migrated and got into contact. So maybe what we see here is deceptive, really. Same for this idea that maybe nominatives are the unmarked or basic or universal pattern, and ergativity is the odd guy out, the strange thing that happens maybe in famous Dierbal, and now you saw an example in Tsintang. And again, if you look at the map, it seems to be the case, right? But who knows? Maybe again, maybe that was the standard pattern before the big spreads. Maybe in the first 200,000 years of human history, that was the standard. Who knows? It's very hard to make these conclusions. And I think these alternative scenarios are totally plausible, especially when you realize that in some societies, ergativity is so deeply ingrained that it really keeps the language going in this. I was always a big fan of the study of Santo Durantes from the mid-90s, when he showed that in Samoan, the use of ergatives is a key aspect of how you function in the society, because it's used to attribute agency and causality to people. It's there, you use it in order to blame who's responsible for something. And so this is something he argues in this study. It's something that is privileged use by senior people in the community who have the right to blame others. So if you see studies like that from the ethnography that show you that ergativity is deeply seated, you think, well, this could have been the core trace in many societies, and who knows, maybe if the Samoans had conquered North America and not the Brits, then maybe that would be the standard now, and we see it all over, right? It's a totally plausible alternative history. So we can look at these typological databases and maps over and over, and the point is that no post hoc generalizations of these databases, no typological statements, this is more common, this is less common, will tell us whether a pattern is preferred because it reflects something biological in our language faculty, or whether it's something that is the product of recent cultural evolution, or maybe even longer-term cultural evolution. We won't know. And so I think maybe that whole area of the line of research, maybe it might not really deliver what we were hoping it would deliver. And so what I've been busy with, and many people in my lab and with my colleagues, were thinking, well, how can we do it differently? How can we still find out something, but not starting from poring over databases and coming up with generalizations? And the idea is to probe first mechanisms directly. So, and what I want to do now is to look at mechanisms that might have a chance to be motivated by what we know from biology. Now, this is a dangerous exercise, of course, and I still feel like we're just scratching the surface and poking in the dark, but this is what I want to do. And so in order to get a better understanding of how agent expressions develop in languages and what's behind them and to what extent they are shaped by biological factors, I want to start with something that has nothing to do with language and go back to an old finding, a famous finding in psychology, and that's the idea of Albert Michot on that there is something deep about perceiving causality, that causality and agency is something that we impose into the world readily, immediately. Now, over the past 60 years, by now it's 70 years since Michot's original work, this has been shown that it's there right from the start. Infants already at 3 months old, and they show this preference that They distinguish causal and non-causal activities. The plots here are from a very recent study from a group in Nijmegen, where they replicated lots of previous findings in a very clean and nice way. The infants distinguish causal from non-causal events. They attribute causality to, chasing events. If you see a dog chasing another, this is really the agent, and that is a causal event and not just a random motion. So this is a very robust finding, but more interestingly, this immediate attribution to agency, to causal agents in a display, is also found in other species. There's not much research on this, but interestingly, OConnell and Dunbar showed this for chimps, but they had the classic experimental setting where you have one event where someone grasps something and takes it away, so a causal event, and one where there is a hand moving around and independent of that something disappears, so spontaneously, not really causation. And chimps distinguish that and are surprised if something doesn't follow the natural pattern of causal action and agency. And even more intriguing is the study that replicated some aspects of Michaud's finding with chicken, a precocial species that's ready to get started right after hatching. And they did imprinting experiments with chicks and gave them a choice after brief training what they prefer, an agent or an not agent, and they preferred, they walked over to agents more than to the patients in a Michautian display. So this suggests that maybe there is a preference for agents, of immediately detecting agents, preferring them, liking them, associating with them, detecting them very quickly, that goes far back in our biological roots. So maybe even to, the most recent common ancestor, the amniotes, the first amniotes of 300 million years ago. This is quite gigantic. So maybe there is something deep-seated. And there is also research more recently by Humphrey and colleagues that showed that we are, as humans, we are amazingly good in detecting agents super quick. So this emerged from a paradigm called the brief exposure paradigm, where you flash subjects a display of an action with an agent, a patient, or whatever, depending on your question, but here an agent at the patient very quickly, maybe below 100 milliseconds. That's a time frame by which you cannot make any inferences, do any higher cognitive processing, you cannot plan sentences, no chance, right? Not even a word you can plan. But so you see this flashing up, and they found that people systematically can recognize who's the agent. They can afterwards recall who's the agent with amazing precision. We replicated this in our lab. That's our PhD student Arate who did the study, and we were wondering whether we can whether there are differences between languages, so that depending on your linguistic experience, you would be more biased towards agents or less biased towards patients. Whether you're better at detecting agents or patients. And what she found is that overall, this is a comparison between Basque and Spanish. Basque is ergative, Spanish isn't. And she found all over, people are way better in recognizing agents than patients in both languages. There are differences, there are significant and super interesting differences between the languages, because the Basque speakers are better in recognizing the probe than Spanish speakers, that's the middle graph. But overall, its agents are doing better than patients. So people visually, right, kind of focus on the agent, they catch it faster and better and more reliably, and they also more reliably can describe the agents than the patients in these brief exposures. So there might be, and I say might be because I think it's still very hypothetical, but there might be a common source of this, namely a deep-seated, biologically inherited tendency to detect agents quickly and spontaneously and seek them out and, place preference on them. It might make sense evolutionarily, because clearly you have a better chance of surviving under any circumstance if you quickly detect agents that might threaten you than patients that get harmed don't matter as much for your survival. So this could complete the story, but obviously that's speculation. But the point is that if there is such a deep-seated biological preference for agent detection, it might be something that carries over to when we perceive not visual stimuli, but linguistic stimuli. And now this is hypothetical, this is speculative, but this is what we are working on. We want to find out that perhaps this drives a preference that you see in language perception, or specifically in sentence comprehension. And this is something that has been established or shown for the first time in the early zeros, and then got together with Ina Brunn-Kessler-Szewski and a PhD student of ours, Luming Wang, and tested this in a number of languages, here in Chinese. So the paradigm is like this: you present people an unmarked noun phrase that is ambiguous by itself, whether it's denotes an agent or a patient. So novel, right, could be an agent, as in the last example, novel educated, or could be a patient, like novel understood. So someone, I understood the novel, and actor, which again could be both. It could understand the actor, or the actor could understand something. And what we found, or what Luming found in this experiment, is that at the position of the verb, if you measure the electrophysiological response, you get what's called an N400 in the ERP literature, event-related potential, which is usually interpreted as reflecting some sort of expectation violation, some sort of disappointment, that it's not what you thought, right, or surprising. And there's many different theories around of what it exactly means, but they all converge on the idea that something didn't quite pan out in the way you started to expect it. So the interpretation we proposed for these findings was that the sentence comprehension system, when seeing an initial or hearing an initial noun phrase, would always assume that, it's going to be an agent, and then when the verb says, it isn't, it's a patient, then you get this disappointment. This would explain why you got this N400 in the blue condition, where novel turns out to be a patient and not an agent, so you get this effect. Now, this is one language, and you could say, well, no wonder, because usually maybe initial noun phrase and the verb construction, so subject and verb, right? That's typically a subject, typically an agent in Chinese. And so no wonder if you have a patient there, that's a non-canonical word order. And so clearly that's why the effect is there. So maybe that's not so interesting. But it gets more interesting now when we look at languages, which we did, that actually have a grammar that says, well, a noun phrase in such a position really should be a patient. And that's languages with ergativity. So Hindi, for example, Kitab, Beti, sold the book, that's the patient, it's in the nominative unmarked case. This is how Hindi works. And so our PhD student Kamal Chaudhary did experiments then contrasting this nominative condition with one where we make it unambiguous, where we attach an accusative case marker, which clearly says, now this is a patient really, and you know it from the start. Now, what he found, and I thought this was quite actually astonishing, we found the same N400 effect at the position of the verb. Now, this is really kind of strange if you think about it. So we have a noun book. That's a bad agent, right? That's an inanimate thing. And so when the verb comes to sell, right, you get an N400. It would be a totally natural thing to have book as a patient followed by sell. We sell books. That's nothing special about that. Yet you get this N400. We interpreted this as, again, reflecting this agent preference. So that against all odds, the comprehension system seems to predict that an initial nominative here should be an agent, and then you get a disappointment when it turns out to be a patient. But it's strange, right? Because discourse the grammar should say it's a patient, and discourse frequencies, again, now we looked at the UD tree banks and did probabilistic models of what a nominative typically is in Hindi. On the left-hand side, you see the stimuli from the experiment. On the right-hand side, it's all nouns we could get our hands on in the corpus. There is a very high probability of these nouns to be really patient. So from a point of view of you know, how your language experience in Hindi develops, you are actually trained on expecting noun phrases in the nominative to be patients. Yet when it is a patient, the brain seems to be surprised and says, oh, something went wrong. And that's kind of really strange. Now, some people have asked, well, could it be that it's just surprising to see a transitive verb that maybe just book and then you expect something intransitive? No, actually, transitives are more common after these nouns in Hindi. At least that's what the models tell us here. Even for the stimuli, there is obviously variation across individual items, but overall there's a grand trend that it's more likely that something is transitive than intransitive after these unmarked nominative noun phrases. Now, much more recently, a PhD student of mine trained a long short-term memory model, so a real language model on the Hindi corpus, and looked very specifically at the surprisal estimates from this corpus. So asking, what is the surprisal? So the minus log probability of the verb in the experimental stimuli after having seen a nominative as opposed to an accusative noun phrase, just what we had in the experiment. And lo and behold, actually, it's more surprising to see these verbs after an accusative. That's the red curves, at least in the perfective condition. That's one aspect condition. In the other condition, the difference is not so strong, but in the same direction. It's more surprising than that, but we got an N400 for what's blue here, for the nominatives. So this really goes, our electrophysiological findings really go directly against what you would predict from language use. Right? It's exactly against it. Now we'd say, well, that's one experiment. That's Hindi, and maybe it's just something went wrong, but it was consistent with everything we have seen in Chinese, in German, in Japanese, in Turkish, and so on. But these are all languages without ergatives. And now we were wondering, so what happens if we now look at an object initial language? Can this tilt like the game and really adapt? So postdoc Sebastian Sauper went to the Solomon Islands together with also Ness, an expert on IVO, and they did an experiment on this language, which as a basic word order has is patient initial, object initial. We verified the impression from the grammar by looking at the corpus, and again you find that an initial noun phrase is much more likely to be a patient than an agent. This is true for human reference, for animate reference, for inanimate reference. It's just more likely to be a patient. So the corpus study confirmed basically the impression from the grammar, but we wanted to be sure, right? And now they ran the same experiment here, and that was really kind of surprising, but also nice because it replicated the finding that we got in Hindi and the other languages. Disambiguating at the position of the verb, when you really know now clearly this was a noun phrase, and you have a verb now, so you know it's an argument of the verb, and it turns out it's a patient that triggered an N400, which is really surprising because the grammar says, yeah, it should be a patient. That's the rule of the grammar, and the corpus says, yeah, in most cases it is actually a patient, yet still we have this effect. So we thought this is actually really a validation of this idea that there is like this detector, an initial noun phrase, unless there is case marking to the opposite, you assume it's got to be an agent, and then you're disappointed a few milliseconds later when it turns out not to be, against even when the grammar tells you it should have been a patient, it's all right, and the discourse frequencies tell you it should be a patient, it's all right, you still have this effect. Intriguingly, and I think making the picture complete, in IVO, we found this effect only with human reference. When you turn to animates, so animal nouns and inanimates, it got reversed. So in this case now, interestingly, the comprehension systems goes exactly with the discourse frequencies. So you expect the noun phrase to be a patient, then comes the verb, and yet there it is, and you are surprised if it turns out to be an agent. If the verb tells you now we have a strange construction and it's an agent, and same with the inanimates. So the agent preference that we saw in Hindi, even with inanimates there, In IVO, it's there only with human reference. So maybe that's the pièce de résistance for the agent preference. It's associated with humans, but if you speak a language that has this gigantic dominance of object initial, patient initial orders, then in the end the comprehension system seems to get retrained or like adapts to it, and this really follows basically the predictions from this course. So the suggestion is that there is an agent preference that might have deep roots in outside language, in our perceptual system, that goes back millions and millions of biological evolution, that still plays a role and affords this privilege to agents in sentence comprehension, even when everything in the language speaks against it. If that's true, we would make a prediction that it should leave a trace when languages change, because it would be more natural for languages indeed to have then agents as privileged and not patients. So effectively a bias over language evolution, privileging nominatives over ergatives, and privileging initial agents over initial patients. Now, I said it's very hard to make inferences on the past because, as I said, you see a set of languages, some red, some blue, and you ask what's the history behind it. Early in my talk, I gave two scenarios of blue dominating, red dominating. In reality, there are thousands of scenarios that are compatible with this. But the good thing is we have technologies now, statistical modeling tools that allow us to make inferences of these thousands of histories. We can build a generative model and make inferences what it predicts on the data, and do it in an MCMC way in exploring the space of probabilities, and make inferences about the most likely model that gave rise to this data. And so in such an example here, the most likely model is one that privileges the red dots, because if you set up transition probabilities in such a way that languages are more likely to move from blue to red, and when they are red to stay red rather than the opposite and go away. If you set the model like this, a generative model like this, then you generate data that are much more compatible with what you see at the end than if you do it the other way around. And this methodology is a great tool, because now we can move away from just counting languages and counting families. We can now count the evolutionary dynamics in families. And this is what we did some years ago when we started this research. Did a study on many languages families around the world, subsetting them per different macro areas, so to avoid these gigantic areal spreads that I mentioned at the beginning, so taking them each as a case. And we found that there are way more language families that show evolutionary biases, that biases in language change really towards nominatives than towards ergatives. And you can project that back into known family histories, and it works very well. It makes the right predictions. They fit very well with the tested historical data. So here just an example from Indo-Iranian, where the model in fact predicts that languages, when they develop ergatives, they will move away from it again, which is exactly what happened in Persian, right? The white dots mean it's only a part of the constructions have become ergative, which would be blue, and most haven't. And what you see in the course of time is that it disappeared again, and modern Persian has no trace of ergativity left anymore. So the models really work. They make the right predictions. They make the right predictions what we currently see and what we know from historical times. So this would go together with this idea that there is an agent bias that affects language change trajectories and induces this bias towards nominatives over ergatives. Now it's no longer interpreting a map and pondering about what might be there. It's now a causal mechanisms for which we have some story in the mechanics of language comprehension that affects how languages change. I see it analogous to what laboratory phonologists tell us about sound change. You can see an effect of, like in language perception, that you mishear something for something else, and that leads to preferred change over the course of sound change. It's exactly parallel, and importantly, it's comprehension based. Now, the model I said would also privilege agent initial over patient initial orders. There we aren't as far as with our ergativity case, but a PhD student, Yingji, took tree banks, UD tree banks, and looked at the distribution of agent initial and patient initial word orders in clauses in Indo-European, so not going by the grammars, but by what, spoken, real use, language use, and fitted again models of evolutionary dynamics, and found that there is a very strong bias towards agent initial order, so that the red part is highly privileged. It's kind of a very strong signal that emerges from these models. So again, this would go together with this idea that the agent preference comes from perception, carries over to how we perceive sentences, how we comprehend them, and this in turn leads to preference for, when you have a choice in language change, that you analyze something as nominative, and again, if you have a choice, as something where the first noun phrase is an agent rather than a patient. And this would explain now that nowadays, indeed, what you see is more agent initial and nominative languages. But now it's a prediction we can make. It's not the back inference that might be deceptive, as I argued in the first part of this talk. Now, I talked a lot about comprehension, and I think it makes a lot of sense, because that's also a big lesson from phonology, that comprehension is really an excellent, or in phonology, a fairly well-established driver of language change. But what about production? And this brings us now to the second question, like, could there also be cultural drivers of language evolution? I think indeed production is really a very different story. Production has to do with interaction, who you produce for, and what you produce when, to whom. It's an interaction game, production. And one of the issues that arises that some people have noticed, Ferreira or Levinson, for example, is that when you produce, this is a gigantic challenge, because you have to be quick, or the brain has to be quick, because people produce immediately after a turn is over. And that means you better start to plan your sentences while you still listen, otherwise you would be way too slow. It takes about 2 seconds to fully plan a full rich sentence, right? That's and we have change turns far more quicker than 2 seconds. It would be boring if we would have to wait 2 seconds before someone else responds, right? So one thing that follows from this is that it's a good idea to keep your plans flexible so that you can adjust, right? Maybe you predict that someone would say something and they say something else than you thought, and so it's good to be able to adjust. So using structures that leave things open are better for this purpose. And if we now compare ergatives and nominatives, something interesting emerges. This is again Hindi. The first 3 lines with Mali, the gardener, have no case marking or nominative case. Nominatives are flexible, because after a nominative, you can continue with an intransitive or with a transitive. It doesn't matter. When you use an ergative, you're stuck. After an ergative, you have to state transitives, because the case is only used for transitive subjects. Now, we were wondering if there is really something about this idea of staying flexible, of, always keeping your options open, keeping 2 different sentence plans still open while you plan. This might be nothing, but if there's something to it, we might be able to see this when we look at what happens in the brain in terms of its oscillator activity. And so we did a study, well, actually for different reasons, but this is a finding we got now. We did a study where we measured oscillator activity during sentence planning. So that's far ahead before you engage into phonetic motor planning. That's just when you set up the basic structure of the sentence at that time frame. That's what we targeted. And it was the first 800 milliseconds of planning in an experiment here. And what we found, that indeed, consistent with this idea of nominatives allowing you to keep open your plans, we found increased activity in the form of event-related synchronization in the theta band for what's called the aligned, that's the nominative situation, than in the ergative situation, what's called the non-aligned. Now, the effect that we found there is one that people outside language have indeed attributed to situations where you have more working memory engagement, where you keep more alternative plans under check, so to speak. So there might really be something genuine to this idea that nominatives are there because they facilitate conversation, that help you keep flexible. Now, that has nothing to do with agency. Right? That has to do with how you interact. You want to interact fast. That is something that's a social aspect and not one that has to do with agency detection. But there are other principles clearly affecting production. One is from work that was done here in Israel. This is a great study by Meyer and colleagues, where they noticed puzzlingly in the beginning that sign languages, especially non-literate sign languages, have much more object initial orders than you would normally expect. And they noticed that this is specifically the case when you have human reference, right? So human reference tend to go first. Why? They are important. They matter for conversation. You talk about the humans first, so they go first. Has nothing to do with agency, preference in comprehension. This is a production thing. You want to get out the humans first. It resonates with this claim by MacDonald, who has this principle of easy first, right? To produce what comes to mind easy first, what matters most. And it might also explain a puzzling phenomenon that Susan Goldin Meadow dug up when looking at home signers, where she found that, at least in one particular case, that this kid would constantly produce object, verb, subject sentences, right? So the object goes first. Why? It's the most important thing, right? Is what you would put out first. Again, it has nothing to do with privileging agents. That is important for perception and comprehension, but not for producing. For producing, you just spit out what matters most immediately, what's the focus of the attention, what is going to be the topic, what you want to talk about. So these are principles that are very different. And I think these principles really matter a lot. And it brings us back to something I mentioned very early in the talk, namely this case study of Samoan that Durante did in the 90s, finding that using agent reference is something you do carefully. It's something that plays to the social situation, to the social status where you use it. You use it more when you are higher into society than lower into society because it has an effect. So production is shaped by these concerns, not by biologically inherited agent preferences. And this actually also resonates with the study that Sabine and I did quite some time ago, where we noticed that generally the use of noun phrases is a cultural variable. It varies heavily. We found this one language, Balthasar, compared to, I think the gray here is Russian, but you could fill in any standard average language that we know. And this language just doesn't use noun phrases as often as others. And we found that people use it really only when at the very end, when you cannot distinguish people anymore, where a conversation would break down, but you hold back with it. It's a cultural thing not to do. So what this means is that we have a completely different story here. We have a cultural driver of agent expression, whereas for the case marking trends in language change, we have maybe a biological driver. So let me wrap this all up with summarizing the main messages of the talk. I think we really need to move away from post-hoc universals. So poring over databases and come up with generalizations of this or that kind might not really tell us much. It might just tell us something about what happened in the recent history, the language spreads and language content. That's terribly interesting, but for that you don't need to talk about universals. For that you need to talk about real human history to the extent that we can reconstruct it, for instance, with population genetics these days. So I think we should really move away from that research paradigm and turn to the mechanisms themselves. And what I presented, I think, is preliminary, is tentative, narrative, and maybe I'm wrong, but it's something that I think is worth investigating further. There's tentative evidence for an agent preference in perception, maybe, as I argued, maybe really going back to deep roots in the animal kingdom. Maybe it's, as I said, maybe it goes back to amniotes and is the same as what we see in chicken now. So something very, very deep rooted. And I argued that maybe this is exactly what we detect in sentence comprehension, where we notice this curious phenomenon that the comprehension system seems to assume that an initial noun phrase, when nothing speaks against it, when there's no case marker like an accusative something, just a bare noun phrase or a nominative unmarked noun phrase, assume that must be an agent even when the grammar and language use so totally speak against it, like we saw in Hindi and Ivo. And I think this also might really be a driver in language change, biasing language change, independent of linguistic area. So really, yeah, in a sense, be a genuine universal in that sense, but now a universal mechanism, not a universal generalization, right? It's a mechanism, a biological driver of language evolution, and might explain to some extent why language is the way they are by kind of going back to the biological roots of language. Anyway, this is a hypothesis out there. The other hypothesis is that production relies on socially driven mechanisms. It's about interactions. It's about, the importance of the things you say, what you want to talk about, what you want to put into the highlight, even the politics, as in the case of Samoa, if that bears out in further research. And so this would be a cultural driver of language evolution. And I think with this way of approaching things, so moving away from post hoc explanations of databases and starting with an idea of mechanisms, we can make perhaps a bit more progress in disentangling the biological and the cultural factors that have shaped the way we speak now, and maybe also the way we have spoken throughout the history of our species. And on that note, I would like to conclude. I'm looking forward to questions, but I also want to really thank my lab members who helped me do all this work, and where we have lots of discussion about these things. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to questions.
Okay, so thank you, Balthasar, for this very exciting talk, and thank you for being exactly on time. So we have already a bunch of questions. People are raising their hands rather than putting them in the Q&A. So I'll start based on how I see them. We'll start with Dorit, please, and then Inbal, Natalia, Yael, and Jack, and Amit.
Thank you for this fascinating talk. I'm just wondering about post hoc investigations. When you're investigating the mind or the brain of Homo sapiens sapiens, aren't you looking or delving into mechanisms that might have been shaped by both evolution and culture, so we are back to square one?
Well, I mean, probing what you see is clearly the best way to generate hypotheses. Right. The issue I have with post hoc explanations is that I don't find them very convincing unless we have a mechanism behind them and we understand the mechanism. And let's face it, I think about 90% of the generalizations that typologists or formal grammarians, for that matter, it doesn't matter, have come up with about how language are based on a snapshot of some languages, and then there is a story about it. And if the story can be underpinned with a causal mechanism, then I'm in game, right? But so it's clearly we need to look at data in order to get inspiration. That's always a good thing to start with.
Okay, Inbal.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I have like 700 questions, but I'll ask one because there are so many hands in the air. So the one question I'll ask is, I really like the distinction you were making between perception biases and production biases. And I think that could be a very useful distinction to kind of tease apart the impact of learning biases versus cultural historical. So I was wondering if you have any more thoughts on how to disentangle them or what you predict one would impact versus the other.
Well, I mean, I take a lot of lessons from phonology, and there clearly there is a very strong convergence of findings that says perception factors matter much more for language change. There are exceptions. In our team ourselves, we made a proposal a couple of years ago that, for instance, the emergence of labidental sounds was chiefly production-driven by changes in anatomical setup. But we need to keep this as an empirical issue, case by case. Now, when it comes to learning, that's obviously a very intriguing aspect, because what is it? It's both perceiving and producing, right? Now, I think in order to make headway there, we really need to distinguish that. And we need to do, in the moment of learning, we have to distinguish which aspect is involved. So following up by perception experiments, specifically and by production experiments, and really see what happens, what drives the change in a learning experiment, for example. So the learning by itself might not be, I mean, if we know it, that's great, but it might not give us the full story. It needs to be completed by more. So.
Right. Ziv?
Yeah, thank you again for a fascinating talk. Very interestingly and sort of counterintuitively, the fact that there are languages which can omit the agent explicitly, like you can say in Hebrew, בעברית כותבים ימין משמאל. In Hebrew, right in plural from right to left, or in England, drive on the left. It seems to be counterintuitive, but in fact, I think the suggestion is that it's so easily recoverable because agency is required. Okay, so you might have an explanation here for the lack of an explicit agent.
Yeah, I mean, but I think really this is production, and I think there is indeed. Why? I mean, there is you produce agents or you don't, and you produce them precisely as you say. When you think it's recoverable, you don't produce it because you assume the hearer can recover it. That's the classical story of agent dropping, that you drop when you can assume that the hearer doesn't need it because it's recoverable. It's accessible.
But in some cases, they're non-explicit at all. Okay, right. They're very generic and you cannot really pinpoint it.
And these are the interesting cases. And that's the cases exactly that I had in mind when I flashed this example from Samoan and Balthasar, where you have a cultural constraint against mentioning agents. Right? There is a cultural issue in Samoan, according to Durantes, that mentioning agents really means that you are entitled to blame someone for having done something. And you do that only if you are entitled to do that. So he has example from dinner conversations where a child started to blame another child for having done something and got immediately scolded by the mother at the table, saying, well, you don't have the right to say, you use an ergative, don't do it. It's impolite, it's rude. And whereas the big chief in the village can use ergatives plentiful and blame whoever he pleases. But this is exactly what I mean with production constraints being culturally driven. You have to do it right the way the society asks.
I think it buys you your generalization rather than just cultural factors, buys you a lot because you do not need to specify. Something will fill in the position because it's required. I think you buy a lot more by referring to it as something which is required, and even if you cannot specify it, it's specifiable somehow.
Mostly, yes. Sometimes you're lost, but let's see, there are other questions maybe we should.
Thank you.
Natalia?
Thank you for this fascinating research. Always pleasure. So I was wondering if I remember correctly, in your 2015 paper, you also had another explanation in terms of memory optimization. Like it is more efficient for memory to start with a subject because it doesn't create like expectation for an object. And if you start with an object, then yeah, it can be more costly because you expect the subject. So, but today you didn't bring this up. So has your opinion changed about this? Are you more into more biological factors and into relevance for evolution maybe of agents like they're dangerous and so on?
No, thank you. If I had 2 hours, I would also have gone into that. That clearly there are alternatives, and and we are actually looking into this in current research. We're doing more experiments. We try to disentangle this. The evidence I've shown is consistent with the biologically rooted agent preference, but we cannot rule out that it might be driven by what you mentioned. So the basic story there is that it's really driven by some sort of semantic dependency minimization. Assuming that the semantic structure of a transitive verb is set up in such a way as is standardly analyzed in most frameworks, that the agent, that the patient and the verb build a package together, and the agent is outside on a higher level. And so the dependency between an agent and the verb is shorter as from a patient, because you're deeper down in the hierarchy. You have to dig in deep into the hierarchy. It's not quite clear how the theory really works. It can be spelled out in different ways. And we now try to disentangle this by running experiments with intransitives, and also looking at the bonds between patients and verbs. So I don't know the answer yet. My current bet is that it will run into big problems, but who knows? Maybe then that turns out to be right. Yeah, it's an open question still. Thank you.
All right, perhaps we have time for one question if it's brief. Jack, is your question brief?
Not too brief, but maybe I can briefen it. Yes, you make some very interesting points that agent preference seems to be biological, and that we shouldn't put too much stake in the observed typological and areal distributions as telling us what's more natural. But I wonder if there's a level at which it would be useful to consider the difference between small scale societies and kind of rapidly expanding societies that may have lots of second language learners that induces falling back on biological substrates. So in other words, strangely enough, the politically and militarily dominant languages would be the ones that are most, quote, primitive in some sense, going back to biology. Definitely. I mean, I think it's been, there's been a bit of a misconception in some parts of typology where people started to pitch contact phenomenon against, universal biases and stuff, because precisely there might be the right locus to look for. I totally agree. The problem is that it's always both. And it's hard to disentangle. And so definitely contact situations are a great locus to look at. Large families are a great locus to look at, also precisely because you have second language speakers that bring in variation, which makes language change possible to begin with. You have to have variation in order to start to change. So these are great loci to do the research, but also at the same time harder, because we need to understand the population history that led to the contact to begin with. So yeah, important but difficult.